Bashar al-Assad became Syria's 19th president in July 2000. He ruled for 24 years before his fall in 2024. His rule was marked by conflict, repression, and civil war. Assad came into power after his father, Hafez al-Assad, who had ruled Syria for 30 years. His father's rule was also marked by tight control and violence. Bashar's time as leader saw the country suffer a great deal. A civil war broke out in 2011, lasting over a decade and leading to many deaths and much suffering. Many countries blamed Bashar for war crimes. He was accused of using extreme violence to crush protests. The Syrian civil war displaced millions of people. Throughout his time in power, he faced calls to step down. By December 2024, rebels took control of Syria's capital, Damascus, forcing Assad to flee. Bashar left Syria and went to Russia, where he was given asylum. His fall marked the end of his family's long hold on power, which had lasted for over 50 years. Critics called Assad's rule a dictatorship. This means one person controls the country with little to no limits on their power. Many said he ruled through fear. As a leader, Bashar relied on military power and support from other countries like Russia. His actions caused his people to suffer and damage Syria deeply. Bashar al-Assad was born in Damascus, Syria, on 11 September 1965. He was the second son in a family of 6 children. His father, Hafez al-Assad, became Syria's president in 1971. Hafez was born into a poor family from a small village. Over time, he worked his way up to power. As president, Hafez ruled Syria with strict control for 3 decades. The Assad family belonged to a minority group called the Alawites. Hafez placed many Alawites in important positions in the government and army to secure his rule. Bashar's early life was quiet compared to his brothers. His older brother, Bassel, was being trained to take over as president. Bashar focused on school and avoided politics. Bashar attended the Arab-French Al-Hurriya school in Damascus, where he studied science and other subjects. In 1982, he graduated from high school and decided to study medicine. Bashar went to Damascus University to become a doctor. He later worked as an army doctor in a military hospital, showing little interest in public life or government. Bashar's family life was complex. His father focused on building his own power, leaving little time for his children. Bashar rarely saw his father at home during his youth. Bassel, Bashar's older brother, was confident and active. He was involved in sports and military training. Bassel's personality was the opposite of Bashar's quiet and shy nature. Unlike his older brother, Bashar was not seen as a future leader. He was more interested in education and enjoyed studying and learning about new ideas and subjects. Bashar had 5 siblings, but 3 of them died. His younger brother Majd had a disability and passed away in 2009. His sister, Bushra, died as a baby. The family's name, al-Assad, means the lion in Arabic. It was changed from Wash, meaning wild, by Bashar's grandfather. This change helped improve the family's image. Bashar's life changed in 1994, when his older brother, Bassel, died in a car accident. Bassel had been trained to lead Syria, and his sudden death left the family without an heir. After Bassel's death, Hafez al-Assad chose Bashar to take his place. This decision surprised many because Bashar had shown little interest in politics or leadership. To prepare Bashar for his new role, Hafez began training him in politics and military affairs. He was enrolled in the military academy in Homs to gain experience. Bashar's training was intense. He had to learn how to command troops and handle military operations. Hafez also introduced him to important officials and party leaders. Propaganda began to build Bashar's image as the hope of the people. State media praised him as a modern and caring leader who would continue his father's work. At the same time, Bashar worked on public projects. He led efforts to fight corruption and improve services, which helped make him more popular with the people. Bashar also gained power in the army. He became a colonel in the Republican Guard, an elite military unit. many officers loyal to his father supported Bashar's rise. In 1998, Bashar was given control over Syrian affairs in Lebanon. This was an important task, as Lebanon was under Syrian military occupation at the time. His role in Lebanon helped him build connections and prove himself as a leader. By the time Hafez died in 2000, Bashar was ready to take over as president. When Hafez al-Assad passed away in June 2000, Syria quickly changed its laws to allow Bashar to become president. The minimum age for the job was lowered to 34. In July 2000, Bashar officially became Syria's president. He promised to bring change and progress, but his rule soon turned out to be similar to his father's. Bashar al-Assad became president of Syria in July 2000. Many hoped he would bring reforms to the country. People believed his education and age could lead to positive change. At first, Bashar gave signals of wanting to modernize Syria. He released political prisoners and allowed more public discussion. This time became known as the Damascus Spring. However, this period of openness was short-lived. Within a year, Bashar cracked down on critics. Writers and activists were arrested, and the government tightened its control. Bashar followed his father's methods to keep power. He filled the government and military with people loyal to him, many of them from his Alawite community. This approach helped him secure his position, but it also created tensions. Other groups in Syria felt excluded from important roles in the government and army. To gain public support, Bashar focused on projects like improving technology. He introduced the internet to Syria and led campaigns to fight corruption. Economically, Bashar tried to open up markets and encourage private business. However, these changes mostly benefited the wealthy, leaving many poor Syrians worse off. In 2005, a major political crisis happened after the assassination of Lebanese leader Rafik Hariri. Many blamed Syria for his death, and Bashar faced global pressure. This event forced Syria to end its long military presence in Lebanon. Bashar's image as a strong regional leader was weakened, both at home and abroad. By the late 2000s, Bashar's government faced growing criticism. Many Syrians felt left out of economic progress, and corruption remained a major problem. While Bashar had promised reforms, his rule became known for the same strict control and limits on freedom as his father's time in power. The Syrian civil war began in 2011, after protests against Bashar al-Assad's government. These protests were part of a larger wave of uprisings called the Arab Spring. Protesters in Syria called for political reforms and more freedoms. They also wanted an end to the corruption and unfair treatment by the government. Bashar responded to the protests with violence. Security forces opened fire on demonstrators, and many people were arrested or killed during the early months. The violence only increased anger among the people. What began as peaceful protests quickly turned into armed resistance as rebel groups formed to fight the government. By 2012, Syria was in a full civil war. Different groups, including the Free Syrian Army and other rebels, fought to overthrow Bashar's government. The conflict became more complicated as foreign countries got involved. Some supported the rebels, while others, like Russia and Iran, backed Bashar's government. The war caused great suffering for ordinary Syrians. Cities were destroyed, and millions of people were forced to leave their homes. Many fled to other countries as refugees. Human rights groups accused Bashar of war crimes. These included attacks on civilian areas and the use of chemical weapons, such as the 2013 Ghouta gas attack. The international community condemned these actions, but efforts to stop the war were often blocked, especially by countries like Russia at the United Nations. By 2020, the war had killed more than 500,000 people and displaced millions more. The country was left in ruins, with schools, hospitals, and homes destroyed. Bashar stayed in power by relying on support from Russia and Iran. Russian airstrikes and Iranian fighters helped him regain control of key parts of the country. However, Syria was deeply divided, with rebels holding some areas and Kurdish groups controlling others. The suffering of the Syrian people only continued. Bashar al-Assad's control over Syria began to weaken in 2024. Rebel groups launched major attacks across the country, including on cities that were once strongholds of his regime. The most significant event came in December 2024, when rebel forces entered Damascus, Syria's capital. The government's defenses quickly collapsed under the pressure of the offensive. On December 8, 2024, as rebel troops approached the city center, Bashar fled the country. He traveled to Moscow, where the Russian government granted him political asylum. That same day, Damascus fell to the rebels, marking the end of Bashar's presidency. His 24 years of rule ended in chaos and left Syria deeply divided and damaged. After his escape, Bashar al-Assad was given asylum in Russia. The Russian government claimed they were protecting him for humanitarian reasons. Many Syrians saw his flight as a final betrayal. They felt he had abandoned his country after years of war, destruction, and suffering caused by his leadership. Bashar's fall marked the end of over 5 decades of Assad family rule. His father, Hafez al-Assad, had come to power in 1971 and built a system based on loyalty and fear. Bashar continued this system, but he failed to maintain the same level of control. His lack of support from ordinary people made his rule weaker over time. The 2024 rebel offensive highlighted his inability to hold on to power. The end of his presidency symbolized a turning point in Syria's long and painful history. The collapse of Bashar's regime did not bring peace to Syria. The country remained divided, with different groups controlling various regions and no clear path forward. Bashar al-Assad's rule was marked by corruption, violence, and fear. Many people, both inside and outside Syria, criticized his leadership for causing harm to the country. One major issue was corruption. Under Bashar, government officials and business leaders loyal to him gained wealth, while ordinary Syrians struggled with poverty. Economic policies favored a small group of elites, leaving most people in worse conditions. Rural areas and working-class neighborhoods felt ignored and abandoned by the government. Bashar's government also faced accusations of war crimes. Human rights groups reported mass killings, torture, and the use of banned weapons, like chemical gas, against civilians. International investigations linked Bashar to attacks such as the 2013 Ghouta gas strike, where hundreds of people, including children, were killed by sarin gas. These actions were condemned by the United Nations and many world leaders. However, efforts to hold Bashar accountable were blocked, often by countries like Russia. Bashar's leadership deepened divisions in Syria. His government was accused of using sectarian policies, favoring his Alawite community while neglecting other groups. Many believed these policies worsened the country's unity and fueled anger among its Sunni majority, who felt targeted by government forces during the civil war. His actions also led to one of the world's worst refugee crises. Millions of Syrians fled the country, seeking safety in neighboring nations in Europe. The international community placed heavy sanctions on Syria during Bashar's rule. These measures aimed to weaken his government, but also hurt the economy further. Countries like the United States and European Union froze assets of Bashar and his allies. They also banned trade, which caused more suffering for the Syrian people. Despite this, Bashar relied on support from Russia and Iran to stay in power. These allies provided military aid and defended him on the global stage. During his rule, Bashar al-Assad worked to build a strong image of himself as a leader. State media presented him as a modern and caring figure who stood for Syria's stability. The government used propaganda to support this image. Pictures of Bashar were displayed everywhere, and media outlets praised him, avoiding any mention of his failures. Despite these efforts, many Syrians saw him as a dictator who ruled through fear. His reputation among the people depended on whether they benefited from or suffered under his rule. Bashar gained support from loyalists, especially those in the military and his Alawite community. These groups saw him as their protector in a time of conflict. However, his harsh actions during the civil war damaged his image. Many accused him of causing great suffering through bombings, sieges, and chemical attacks. As the war continued, even some of his supporters began to question his leadership. Discontent grew among Syrians as poverty and destruction worsened. Outside Syria, Bashar was widely seen as a dictator responsible for war crimes. International organizations and world leaders often condemned his actions and called for his removal. While some countries supported Bashar, others placed sanctions on his government and recognized opposition groups as the rightful representatives of Syria. The Syrian conflict became a symbol of suffering and resistance, with Bashar's name tied to the destruction of his country and the struggles of its people. Bashar's legacy remains deeply divided. To his supporters, he was a defender of Syria. To his critics, he was a tyrant whose actions led to years of war and loss. The millions of refugees who fled Syria during his rule see his leadership as a disaster. Their stories of loss and suffering have shaped how the world views him. Bashar al-Assad's rule over Syria lasted for 24 years, ending in 2024 when he fled the country. His time as leader left a deep impact on Syria's history and its people. He began as a leader who promised change and modern reforms. However, his presidency quickly turned into one marked by violence, corruption, and oppression. Under his leadership, Syria suffered from war, division, and destruction. Millions of people were forced to leave their homes, and the country's future became uncertain. Bashar's fall in 2024 marked the end of over 50 years of Assad family rule. His presidency showed how power built on fear and control can fail over time. Many Syrians hoped for a brighter future after his departure, but the country remained divided. Rebel groups, foreign powers, and other forces continued to fight for control. Bashar's legacy is one of tragedy and lessons. His actions remind the world of the dangers of unchecked power and the harm that leaders can cause to their own people. Syria's story during Bashar's rule is also a story of resilience. Despite the hardships, many Syrians have shown incredible strength and hope for a better future. The Syrian civil war also highlights the role of the international community. Countries that supported or ignored Bashar's actions share responsibility for the crisis. Looking back at Bashar's presidency, the world can learn the importance of standing against oppression and supporting those who fight for freedom and justice.